Thank you, Mitch. Always a difficult act to follow. I'm going to speak to you this morning. The topic will be marketing strategies for specialty care. And I'd like to start with a question to the audience. And the question is, in 2009, which market segment grew the fastest? Was it branded primary care, biotech, oncology, or the generic sector? The answer is 36, 26, 35. So a bit of a split along the back end. I'll give you the real answer. Next slide, please. Probably can't see it very well, but branded primary care grew about 1.6% in 2009, biotech 16, oncology 10, and generics grew at an 11% rate. Now, it's a little bit unfair to the primary care sector because in 2009 we saw a lot of the major molecules go generic, so that made the numbers a little bit smaller than they should have been. The point I would like to make is that the specialty segment is growing at an increasingly rapid rate, and a lot of companies are finding themselves, because of their pipelines, thrust into specialty care and specialty care marketing. What I'd like to talk about is it different than primary care marketing. So in order to answer that question, I thought about marketing and I immediately thought about strategy. And I looked in the Oxford English Dictionary and looked up the definition for strategy. So what's strategy? Strategy is a plan of action designed to achieve a goal. A plan of action designed to achieve a goal. So that's pretty straightforward. So I thought, well, are the goals different in primary care marketing versus specialty care marketing? Well, I think you'll see from this chart that the goals are pretty well identical. You're selling a pharmaceutical product, they both have the same goals. Therefore, one might ask, should there be a change in the strategies? In other words, are they both apples, but maybe they're just different brands of apples? What I'd like to say is it's not about the goal that we should be looking at, but about the environment or the challenges that we would face, and those things will define the strategy. So let's take a quick look at what a specialty market might look like in today's environment. Number one, they're probably very complex therapies. They tend to be biologics, things like Avastin, Remicade, Tisabri, pretty complex molecules. Usually you have a small number of target customers. Many of these markets have 200 or less people who actually prescribe the products. Certain of the specialty markets, it's much smaller than that, where you have maybe 50 customers drive the entire market. The audience tends to be highly sophisticated and have a high expectation level in terms of what they would like to hear from the industry. And it's very scientifically based. Things move quickly. Interestingly enough, in some of the areas like HIV and transplant, what used to be short-term markets, because of advances in drug therapy, they're becoming chronic markets because patients are living longer. So that's kind of a view of the environment that you would face in a specialty market environment. So there are some major differences between that and primary care, and I'm going to tell you that some of them will be how you deploy your sales force. Science really becomes the driver, and data becomes the driver. Patient advocacy groups, certainly important in primary care as well, but yield large influence in specialty markets. The reimbursement hurdles tend to be very high because these drugs are not cheap. And it'll also affect things like marketing mix and communication channels. So let's first look at why deployment changes. I think deployment changes because largely the audience has changed. In the GP world, you're calling on 8,000 to 10,000 high-prescribing GPs. You're trying to get messages out to them. In the specialty world, most of these physicians are in some sort of a group practice in these specialty markets. They're working in a department, an oncology department. They're working in a team. It's no longer just the physician, it's the pharmacist, it's the nurse. Everybody plays a role. These people often have influence on guidelines, or they're influenced by guidelines. They often have a research interest, and they're very scientifically oriented. So you can see right away, these basic differences are going to force us to have a strategic approach that's slightly different. So what does that look like? Your sales force has to be highly technically driven. You have to have salespeople that probably are very scientifically oriented, and that's the expectation of the customer. This is not a reach and frequency sales game any longer. Although everyone will agree reach and frequency is important, it is not the driver in a specialty market. Rather, representatives are driven by projects and plans and things that they're trying to accomplish with the departments and the specialists they're calling on. You have to be able to sell the science, and you have to work as part of a team. So sales is but one group of people who will now call on these specialists, and pharmaceutical companies are recognizing that, so I'll speak to that in a second. These representatives will often become part of the team in the institution. So they're accepted as somebody who's bringing value, and they'll be part of the team in the institution. So that's the sales force. What it probably looks like, this is an example of an HIV product. A sales force of 6 across the country would not be unusual, and the average territory might sell $20 million per representative. So huge difference from what you see in primary care, where a territory might be $1 to $2 to $3 million per representative. So it changes dynamics completely. Second, science is the driver. In many of these areas, you go to a conference or a convention, a research paper will be presented, and your physicians will go home and change protocols. So certainly in HIV and oncology, this is not unheard of. So things move rapidly and things change rapidly. It's very, very much about science. So companies who are good at specialty marketing have started to look at putting resources into MSLs, into their medical departments, into investing in the science. This is an example of irinotecan and topotecan, 2 cancer products. You probably know irinotecan best as Camtazar. The orange line that you see going up to the left is the sales of Irono, and Topo is at the bottom. So they're both the same class. They're not exactly the same drug, but you can see irinotecan did much, much better. Lots of reasons for that to happen, but interestingly enough, irinotecan in the green bars are the publications that they have invested in. So they've invested in a clinical program that produced that many publications, twice as many as Topo, and their sales reflected large growth. Lots of other reasons why that may have happened, but if you're going to play in a specialty place or specialty space, you're going to have to be investing in the science. If you're not going to do well in this area. Advocacy groups, certainly in the primary care side, also important. But these diseases for specialty care and the biologics tend to be smaller diseases, smaller groups of patients, niche markets. So you have very small, well-educated vocal groups of patients. And they can actually move, I think one of our speakers spoke to it earlier, they can actually move reimbursement. They can actually change the way things get funded. So very, very powerful group for specialty. Speaking of reimbursement, the message here is that it's a data-driven world. Reimbursement will not happen without great data. So if you're not willing to invest in the science, on the science side, you're also not going to get the quality of life and the economic information. This is an example of a product called Viriad, which is for hepatitis B. And the indication at the top is the Health Canada indication. So hepatitis B, patients 18 years and older. Pretty straightforward. The bottom chart looks at how the payers have decided to pay for it. And you can see the payers have decided that there's actually 2 types of patients, treatment naive and treatment experienced. And if you're in BC and you've had the drug before, you're not going to get it again. At least you won't get it paid for. In Ontario, you'll get it for the second time, but you have to meet certain criteria. And if you live in Alberta or Quebec, they're going to give it to you regardless. So obviously, this is all data-driven. They didn't just make these decisions in isolation. So the pharmacoeconomic reimbursement part is also data-driven. The message is, if you're going to be in specialty, it's all about the data. So the key areas of strategic focus are 5-fold, really. You have to have a great regulatory strategy. That's a life cycle strategy. That's making sure that your label reflects what the payers are going to expect, but also reflects what the physicians are going to expect for their product. The funding strategy, similar to what I've just spoken to. The big one is probably the medical strategy. So if you're not going to invest in the science, if you're not going to invest in MSLs, if you're not going to invest in medical conference attendance, funding IITs, investigator-initiated trials, it's a space that you're going to have difficulty working in. Stakeholders we've spoken to, and then the last point is even promotionally, you will actually see differences in specialty pharma. So what does that look like? This is a marketing mix comparison of a couple of different products, one in primary care and one in specialty. So remember, the market's more complex, the products are more complex, and there's way fewer customers. Those 2 things alone completely change how the mix looks. On the left-hand side, if you look at the blue, I think it's the blue bar, journal ads. The blue slice on the right-hand side, much, much smaller. And that's because when you have an audience of 200 physicians, journal ads is probably not the best way to get to them, especially when you have great access to them through your sales force and MSLs. On the other hand, you want to develop key opinion leaders, and a lot of your resources on the specialty side are going to be put into key opinion leader development ad boards, those types of things. You won't do that as much when you have 8,000 to 10,000 customers on the primary care side. Finally, if you look at something as simple as detail aids, the green slice, much, much smaller on the right-hand side, and that's because detail aids are almost non-existent in specialty care. So specialty care physicians really don't want to see the glossy detail aid. They want to see clinical papers. So your sales force will sell from clinical papers. They want to see guidelines. They want to see product slide sets that are going deep into the science, probably delivered by an MSL. They want to see forum on HPV. They want to see collateral materials from conventions that they've attended. It's all about the science. So in conclusion, 8 strategies if you want to be successful in specialty pharma. The first 4, I would say, are probably applicable as well to primary care. You want to gain key opinion leader support early. Develop the value for money. In other words, make sure you have the data to go to those payers. Have a clearly defined patient profile. This is important in specialty pharma, you saw from the earlier example, not just for the physicians anymore, but for the payers. You better tell the payers who you want them to pay the drug or pay for the drug, or else you're going to get the chart that I showed you earlier. Definitely plan for variation in that reimbursement criteria. It will change from province to province. It will change with the data that becomes available. You need to invest in the science. I've talked about that several times. And you also have to be very nimble. So medical opinion changes quickly. It'll change by attending a convention and a research paper being presented. Start to invest in non-traditional things. You're going to have to heavy up on things like medical science liaisons, your medical department, your investment in clinical trials, your investment in payer groups and patient advocacy groups. And then finally, if you're not good at working the conventions because you're used to primary care, you'll not do well in specialty pharma because it's all about getting to the convention, meeting your customers, and seeing what the most recent science is. So the original question was, are they the same? And I would say, well, they're both edible, but they're definitely different. Thank you.